The day HR made me cry in the parking lot, it wasn't because I had lost an argument. It was because I finally realized nobody inside that building was going to help me. I still remember standing beside my car, gripping my keys so tightly my hand hurt, while the HR director walked past me with a satisfied smile. 20 minutes earlier, she had publicly blamed me for a failure I had nothing to do with. My manager stayed silent. My coworkers stared at the table. Not one person spoke up. By the time the meeting ended, I felt like my entire career had been erased in less than an hour. What hurt most wasn't the accusation. It was how easily everyone accepted it. I sat in my car that afternoon and cried until I could barely breathe. Then I wiped my face, started the engine, and made a decision nobody knew about. I wasn't going to fight them. I wasn't going to defend myself. And I definitely wasn't going to beg anyone to believe me. Instead, I spent the next 6 months quietly preparing for something they never saw coming. Because while HR thought they had pushed me out of the company, they had accidentally handed me the one thing that would eventually make every single one of them avoid looking me in the eye. My name is Emma, and at the time this happened, I was 28 years old and working as a senior operations coordinator for a fast-growing logistics company outside Chicago. I wasn't the loudest person in the office, and I wasn't interested in office politics. I liked solving problems, meeting deadlines, and going home without drama. For nearly 4 years, that approach worked. My performance reviews were consistently strong, department managers trusted me, and several of our biggest clients requested me by name whenever issues came up. Everything changed when a new HR director named Vanessa arrived. Within months, the atmosphere inside the company became different. Employees started disappearing after private meetings. Complaints were quietly dismissed. Favoritism became impossible to ignore. People who questioned decisions suddenly found themselves receiving negative evaluations. Most employees noticed it, but nobody wanted to become the next target. Unfortunately, I became exactly that. It started with small things being excluded from meetings, losing project responsibilities without explanation, and hearing rumors that sounded strangely similar to confidential conversations I had only shared with HR. Each incident seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they painted a picture I didn't want to believe. By the time that meeting ended with me crying alone in the parking lot, I finally understood something important. Vanessa wasn't just hurting me. She had been hurting a lot of people for a very long time. For a while, I convinced myself I was imagining things. It felt easier than accepting the alternative. After all, HR departments are supposed to protect employees, not target them. But once I started paying attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Vanessa rarely raised her voice, rarely sent threatening emails, and never did anything dramatic enough to attract immediate attention. Instead, she operated through subtle pressure. Employees who disagreed with her suddenly found promotions delayed. People who reported concerns somehow ended up being labeled difficult to work with. Managers who supported certain employees were quietly encouraged to reconsider their opinions. The system was so carefully designed that every individual action looked reasonable by itself. Together, however, they created a culture of fear. I experienced it firsthand when one of my largest projects was reassigned without explanation. When I asked my manager, he looked uncomfortable and said the decision had come from higher up. 2 weeks later, I learned the project had been given to someone with less experience and almost no knowledge of the client. The client immediately contacted me asking why I was no longer involved. I kept my response professional and simply said leadership had made a different decision. What I didn't know then was that Vanessa had already begun building a narrative about me behind the scenes. Small comments appeared in performance discussions. Questions about my attitude surfaced despite years of positive reviews. Managers who had previously praised my work suddenly became distant. Then came the incident that changed everything. A major shipping delay affected several clients. The problem originated from a vendor contract negotiated months before I ever touched the account. Yet during an executive meeting, Vanessa presented a summary suggesting operational oversight had contributed to the issue. My name appeared multiple times. I remember looking around the room expecting someone to correct the record. Nobody did. My manager avoided eye contact. The executives accepted the presentation and moved on. By the end of the meeting, it sounded as though I was personally responsible for a situation I had actually spent weeks trying to fix. When I requested a private discussion afterward, Vanessa calmly informed me that my concerns would be documented. Then she suggested that emotional reactions often prevented employees from seeing situations objectively. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not because I believed her accusations, but because I realized she had carefully positioned herself as the authority on every conversation. She controlled the narrative. She controlled access. She controlled documentation. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt completely isolated. I cried harder than I had in years. But once the tears stopped, something else replaced them. Clarity. During the previous months, I had noticed strange inconsistencies. Employees leaving unexpectedly. Missing records. Complaints that vanished. Performance reviews that contradicted written feedback. At the time, I dismissed those observations because they weren't directly connected to me. Now I wondered if they were connected after all. Instead of searching for another job immediately, I started organizing information. Every document I legally possessed. Every performance review. Every project record. Every client compliment. Every policy update. I created folders at home and built timelines showing exactly when key events occurred. The more I reviewed, the more unusual things appeared. Several employees had received negative evaluations shortly after reporting concerns. Promotion decisions frequently involved people with personal relationships to HR leadership. Documentation dates didn't always match meeting dates. None of it proved wrongdoing by itself, but it revealed a pattern worth understanding. Then an unexpected email arrived from a former coworker named Rachel. She had left the company 6 months earlier after what leadership described as a voluntary resignation. Her message contained only one sentence. I'm starting to think what happened to me wasn't an accident. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied with 4 words that would change everything. Tell me what happened. Rachel called me that evening, and within 10 minutes I realized her experience sounded disturbingly familiar. She described being praised for years, then suddenly receiving criticism that seemed disconnected from her actual performance. Meetings began happening without her. Responsibilities disappeared. HR documented concerns she claimed had never been discussed with her before. Eventually, she was presented with a choice: accept a separation package or face a formal performance improvement plan that could damage her professional reputation. Exhausted and scared, she took the package and left. At the time, she believed she had simply become unlucky. But after hearing rumors from former coworkers, she started wondering whether something larger had been happening behind the scenes. Over the next several weeks, Rachel connected me with other former employees. Some had resigned. Others had been terminated. A few had accepted settlements that prevented them from discussing specific details publicly, so they were careful about what they shared. Even with those limitations, similarities emerged. Multiple people described confidential conversations somehow becoming known to managers. Several reported performance concerns appearing only after they challenged decisions or reported problems. One former supervisor told me he had repeatedly questioned documentation practices but eventually stopped because every objection seemed to create trouble for him personally. None of these stories alone proved misconduct. What they did prove was that I wasn't imagining the pattern. For the first time since that meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: confidence. Not confidence that I would win some dramatic battle, but confidence that reality existed outside Vanessa's carefully managed version of events. Meanwhile, conditions inside the company continued deteriorating. Because I remained employed, I had a front row seat. Employees became increasingly reluctant to speak during meetings. Turnover accelerated. Clients complained about inconsistency. Several experienced workers left within a short period of time, taking years of institutional knowledge with them. Leadership blamed the labor market. Employees blamed leadership. Nobody seemed willing to address the deeper issue. Then another event caught my attention. One of our most respected project managers, a woman named Diane, suddenly received a disappointing performance review despite delivering one of the strongest years in the department. She was shocked. Everyone was shocked. Even her manager appeared uncomfortable discussing it. Watching her leave a conference room looking defeated brought back memories of my own experience. That night, I made a decision. Instead of merely collecting information, I would start preserving it in a professional, organized manner. I wasn't trying to build a case against anyone. I simply wanted an accurate record. Every meeting summary, policy revision, timeline, performance metric, and client communication was carefully documented according to company policy and legal guidelines. Months passed. Vanessa remained confident. If anything, she appeared more powerful than ever. Then something unexpected happened. A large client requested an operational review after repeated staffing changes disrupted service quality. This wasn't unusual by itself. Major clients often asked questions when performance declined. What made this situation different was the person leading the review. His name was Michael Grant, a senior executive from the client's parent company. Unlike most outside stakeholders, Michael had worked in corporate compliance before moving into executive leadership. During the review process, he asked detailed questions most people never considered. Why had experienced employees left so quickly? Why had successful teams been reorganized repeatedly? Why did some personnel records appear inconsistent with documented performance results? Leadership treated the questions as routine. I noticed Vanessa becoming slightly less comfortable during each meeting. It wasn't obvious to most people. But after months of observing her, I could see it. For the first time, someone was examining outcomes instead of accepting explanations. A week later, Diane quietly approached my desk. She looked nervous. After confirming nobody was nearby, she handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a list of names. Every person on it had either left the company or been pushed into lesser roles during the previous 2 years. I recognized nearly all of them. Then Diane pointed to one name near the bottom and whispered something that made my stomach drop. That employee filed a complaint against HR 6 months before being terminated. Suddenly, what had looked like a pattern began resembling something much more serious. I took the paper home and spent most of the night reviewing everything I had collected during the previous months. For the first time, I stopped looking at individual incidents and started looking at timing. That was when the connections became impossible to ignore. Employees who raised concerns about favoritism often received negative evaluations within months. Workers who questioned policy changes suddenly found themselves excluded from projects. Several people who had reported problems involving HR later experienced career setbacks that seemed completely unrelated on the surface. Viewed separately, each situation could be explained away. Viewed together, they formed a timeline that raised uncomfortable questions. I still had no intention of becoming a whistleblower or launching some dramatic confrontation. My goal remained simple: protect myself and preserve facts. But circumstances were beginning to move on their own. Michael Grant's review expanded. What had started as a client concern about staffing disruptions gradually evolved into a broader examination of operational stability. More executives became involved. Additional records were requested. Managers were interviewed. Departments were asked to explain unusually high turnover rates. The atmosphere inside the office shifted almost overnight. People who normally walked with confidence suddenly seemed cautious. Meetings became shorter. Leadership conversations moved behind closed doors. Even Vanessa appeared more guarded. Then came a moment I will never forget. During a routine review meeting, one executive asked why so many top-performing employees had left within a relatively short period. Before anyone could answer, Michael calmly requested supporting documentation behind several performance-related decisions. The room went silent. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't hostile. It was simply a request. Yet the reaction around the table told me everything. People looked at one another. Some searched through papers. Others avoided eye contact. Vanessa eventually provided explanations, but they sounded different from the certainty she usually displayed. For the first time, I saw hesitation. A few days later, something even more surprising happened. A former manager contacted me directly. His name was Robert, and he had left the company almost a year earlier. We met for coffee on a Saturday morning. Robert explained that he had repeatedly challenged certain HR recommendations involving employee discipline and performance evaluations. According to him, documentation often seemed incomplete or selectively presented. Whenever he pushed back, resistance followed. Eventually, he accepted a position elsewhere rather than continue fighting internal battles. What shocked me most was not his story. It was what he brought with him. Robert carried copies of meeting summaries, personal notes, and correspondence he had legally retained after leaving the company. None of it contained confidential client information. What it did contain were detailed records showing multiple occasions where managers questioned HR actions and received little response. Again, no single document proved wrongdoing. But collectively, they revealed a pattern of ignored concerns stretching back years. Around the same time, Diane informed me that additional employees had quietly spoken to investigators conducting internal reviews connected to Michael's findings. Rumors spread throughout the building. Some people dismissed them. Others became visibly nervous. Vanessa maintained a calm public image, but I noticed subtle changes. Her office door remained closed more often. She held fewer informal conversations. Meetings with executives increased. Then 6 months after the day I cried in the parking lot, everyone received an invitation to a mandatory company-wide meeting. No explanation was provided. The timing alone created anxiety. By the morning of the meeting, entire departments were speculating about layoffs, restructuring, or major organizational changes. Hundreds of employees gathered in the largest conference space the company had. I arrived early and took a seat near the back. Vanessa sat near senior leadership. She appeared composed, but there was tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. When the CEO walked to the front of the room, conversations immediately stopped. He thanked everyone for attending and announced that an extensive internal review had recently concluded. Then he said a sentence that caused the entire room to freeze. The findings revealed serious concerns regarding how certain employee matters were handled over the past several years. At that moment, every eye in the room turned toward the leadership section. The silence inside that room felt almost unreal. Hundreds of employees sat completely still as the CEO continued speaking. He explained that the review had uncovered a pattern of procedural failures involving employee complaints, performance evaluations, disciplinary actions, and documentation practices. Several decisions that had significantly affected careers were found to be unsupported by the available evidence. Other cases revealed inconsistencies between official records and information provided by managers, employees, and outside reviewers. The CEO was careful with his language. He wasn't interested in creating a public spectacle. He focused on facts, accountability, and the steps the company would take moving forward. But everyone understood what he was saying. For years, people had quietly wondered whether something was wrong. Now leadership was confirming it. Then came the announcement nobody expected. Effective immediately, multiple members of the HR leadership team were no longer employed by the company. Vanessa's name was among them. A wave of whispers moved through the room. Some people looked shocked. Others looked relieved. A few simply stared ahead as though they were trying to process everything they had just heard. I looked toward the front and saw Vanessa sitting completely motionless. The confidence she had carried for so long was gone. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room. 6 months earlier, she had watched me walk out of a meeting feeling humiliated and powerless. Now she couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second before looking away. The CEO then introduced a compliance consultant who would oversee reforms, employee protections, and a review of past personnel decisions. Employees who believed they had been unfairly affected would have opportunities to request reconsideration. The announcement lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact changed the company overnight. Over the following weeks, investigations continued. Former employees were contacted. Records were re-evaluated. Several disciplinary actions were reversed. Some workers received promotions they should have received long before. Others were offered settlements related to previous decisions. The company wasn't trying to erase the past. It was trying to correct it. What surprised me most was what happened next. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting with senior leadership. Walking into that room felt strangely familiar because 6 months earlier I had entered a meeting expecting fairness and left in tears. This time was different. The CEO, my department vice president, and 2 executives from the review committee were waiting. They thanked me for my professionalism throughout an extremely difficult period. Then they explained something I never knew. During the review process, multiple clients had specifically mentioned my work. Several managers, including people from other departments, had submitted statements describing my contributions. Even former employees had spoken positively about me. While I had spent months believing my reputation had been destroyed, the truth was exactly the opposite. The people whose opinions actually mattered had been paying attention all along. A few weeks later, I was promoted into a newly created operations leadership role focused on process improvement and employee support. The promotion came with more responsibility, better pay, and direct access to executives. But the title wasn't the most satisfying part. The most satisfying part was realizing I never had to fight dirty to get there. I never spread rumors. I never attacked anyone. I never tried to destroy careers. I simply documented facts, remained professional, and allowed the truth enough time to catch up. Months later, I ran into a former coworker at a networking event. During our conversation, Vanessa's name came up briefly. The coworker shook his head and said, "It's strange. She used to make everyone nervous. Now nobody even wants to talk about her." I understood exactly what he meant. Real power isn't making people fear you. Real power is building a reputation that survives when every document is reviewed, every question is asked, and every excuse disappears. The day HR made me cry in the parking lot felt like the worst day of my career. Looking back now, it was the day everything finally started moving in the right direction. Because 6 months later, they couldn't look me in the eye not because I got revenge, but because the truth did. When people hear this story, they usually assume the most satisfying moment was watching Vanessa lose her position. It wasn't. The real payoff came much later. It came the first time I walked into work without feeling anxious. It came when employees who had spent years staying silent finally felt safe enough to speak honestly. It came when talented people started receiving opportunities based on their actual performance instead of office politics. And it came when I realized that my career had never depended on the opinion of one person. For months, I thought my reputation had been destroyed. In reality, the people who truly mattered had been quietly paying attention all along. Looking back, I don't regret staying calm. I don't regret refusing to play the same games. And I definitely don't regret choosing patience over panic. Sometimes karma isn't loud. Sometimes it arrives through facts, accountability, and the simple collapse of a false story. The people who underestimated me expected an emotional reaction. What they got instead was time, documentation, and the truth. And in the end, that was more powerful than anything I could have said in that parking lot. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, underestimated at work, or forced to stay silent while others controlled the narrative, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about workplace karma, hidden success, and calm payback, subscribe for more.